Always true.
We ask the questions.
What is needed in the world?
Is that going to be?
Is there a future for the war-torn countries of the Middle East and beyond? If so, who will build it and what will it look like? These are questions many people who live here ask themselves every day. In an attempt to provide an answer, business leaders and government officials came together for an event spearheaded by the White House last week, the so-called Global Entrepreneurship Summit in Silicon Valley, California. Here, high-tech investors, innovators, and political representatives from around the world came together to exchange ideas, contacts, and concepts that, in their mind, could lead to a constructive future. This is the 7th time this summit has taken place. But how meaningful is the concept of entrepreneurship for those who are living with civil war, mass migration, and sectarian conflict? And how is the Obama administration responding to critics who feel the White House has been ineffective in dealing with these conflicts, including critics who work inside the State Department? To discuss this, we sit down with John Kerry, the U.S. Secretary of State, and Ben Rhodes, spokesman for the National Security Council at the White House, all here on Talk to Al Jazeera.
Mr. Secretary, thank you very much for doing this.
I'm delighted, thank you.
We want to start off with the summit, first of all. This is the 7th one?
Yes.
How do you practically measure the success of an event like this in terms of impacting countries in the Middle East, for example?
Well, the fact is that there are many new businesses represented here. I just met with a group that were part of our exchange in our Education and Cultural Affairs Department, and they are, each of them, every one of the people in it, now running their own businesses. And each of them says that they're applying lessons that they learned in the course of the entrepreneurial summits. So this is, I mean, we are going to announce $10 billion of investment that will be solidified here in the next 2 days. So it's going to go back to the Middle East, to Africa, to South Central Asia, to South Asia. I mean, it's a remarkable amount of energy that all comes together in one place with lots of ideas that suddenly find a way to be able to take those ideas and actually begin to get some capital behind them, and then some experience in how to actually turn it into a product and sell it and make something out of it.
Now, as you know, Mr. Secretary, there are countries in the Middle East, Syria, Yemen, Libya, where basically the guns are talking at this particular point in time.
Right.
Now, to people in those countries, when they look at what's happening here during this summit, what should they find in it?
They should find the possibility of peace. They should find that this is a better alternative than using the guns, that this is the future. And what we're seeing is countries in the Middle East are beginning to embrace a diversification of their economies. The United Arab Emirates, for instance, has been ahead of that curve for some period of time, and they're being very successful at it. Saudi Arabia, recently the Deputy Crown Prince announced on behalf of King Salman a major new economic initiative called 2030, which is geared towards diversification so that they are less dependent on black liquid coming out of the sand and dependent on new jobs for young people. There are massive numbers of young people in almost every country now in the world who are going to need jobs. So the only people who really create the jobs are entrepreneurs.
But if you're sitting somewhere like Syria, for example, where
well,
people
now it's,
and things are being blown
now
to
it's not a possibility, I understand that.
Yeah.
But it's a vision. You have to have a place you want to go. And leaders need to be providing people with that vision. Now, obviously, we have to end the war. We're trying very hard, working with the Russians, with our 66 nations in the coalition. We are trying to find a political path to end the war. But this kind of entrepreneurial activity will be critical to the rebuilding of Syria, the rebuilding of Yemen, the rebuilding of Libya. And I think that that's what's exciting about the possibilities here.
Now, you mentioned Syria and what you're trying to do in Syria to bring about peace. Do you sometimes look at Syria and you say the Obama administration should have done much more earlier so that things would not have got to where they are now?
No, I don't spend an instant going backwards right now. I'm totally focused on now, on how we can bring about a true ceasefire, on what we need to do to have a real transition according to the Geneva communique and process that Iran and Russia and Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia and all of us have embraced in the United Nations Resolution 2254. That's what we're driving for. And all of my energy is going forwards, not backwards.
Mr. Secretary, you know, someone will listen to what you're saying and they'll say, we've been hearing this logic for over 5 years now and things have not got better in Syria. They've got worse, a lot worse.
Well, for a moment, we had a genuine ceasefire for a little while, and we proved to people, because life changed suddenly in Syria. People were out in cafes, people were choosing to demonstrate, people were moving with greater freedom. Aid was getting to communities that hadn't seen aid in years. So people had a taste of what the possibility is. Now, yes, it began to fall apart because of, it began to fray because of mutual accusations that the Assad regime was continuing to attack in Aleppo, that the opposition was continuing to press its fight in Aleppo or Latakia or Daraya somewhere. And so there was this counter for, you know, each person claiming the right to be counterattacking. That's a failed process. And what we are talking about with Russia now and others is how do we guarantee that we have clarity about a genuine cessation where we know who's responsible for breaking it and people will be held accountable for breaking it. And that's what we're working on.
Now, there are people in your department who are not very happy about this approach, and they think that you should have been, as an administration, more stringent with the Assad regime. Since the 51 State Department officials have signed the document, which you know, how much pressure are you personally, John Kerry, Secretary of State, you feel under to move in the direction those officials want you to go?
I don't feel pressure from that. That's not. I feel pressure from the children I see getting killed and the women and the innocent civilians in Syria. That's the pressure. The pressure I feel is what motivated me to go to Vienna last November and begin to put together the International Syria Support Group and work towards peace. I mean, 5 years of war and you know, 450,000 plus people dead and people tortured and gassed and barrel bombed. That's enough pressure. That's enough motivation to get something done.
But what do you say to people both here in the United States and in the region who look at what's happening in Syria and they'll say, if you had taken more stringent action against the Assad regime, you would not be dealing with the kind of situation that you're dealing with now. ISIS,
well, you
refugees,
know, look,
instability in Europe.
Hypotheticals are so easy to play with. Who knows? Honestly, hypotheticals are very easy to play with. The fact is that we are fighting Daesh. We are fighting Nusra. We are fighting against the designated terrorist groups, and we are making great headway in that effort. Now, the Assad regime needs to heed the advice and counsel of those who are supporting it and begin to live by the standards of the cessation of hostilities. And I think it's important for us to continue to put the pressure on in order to try to make that happen, and that's what we're going to continue to do.
Mr. Secretary, the situation with the Gulf countries, particularly in light of the agreement signed by the United States and its allies with the Iranians. The Saudis are not very happy about it. That's no secret. Where do you think your message is getting lost to them? Because the Obama administration is telling them, the fact that we're sorting things out with Iran does not mean that we're sacrificing our relations with the Saudis and others.
I think that's honestly, I think that is either an exaggeration or a misinterpretation. The Saudis have told us again and again that they supported the agreement, they support what we have done, and they support what we're doing today, which is making certain that any country is not engaged in meddling in another country's affairs. We have intercepted weapons that were coming down into Yemen. We have sanctioned where we thought it was necessary because of missile activity. We are working very hard to try to see if there's a peaceful way to resolve these differences. And there is, you have to be very thoughtful about where and how you apply force because it always has other downstream impacts and effects.
The Obama administration is almost at its end. Do you feel that the time separating us now from the end of the Obama administration is enough for you as an administration to deal with all these complicated issues like Syria and like relations with the Saudis and the Iranians?
Yes. Well, I mean, certainly we are going to work right up until January 20th of next year. And we believe there is a lot of time. I mean, 6 months, 7 months is a lot of time to be able to accomplish things. We've been working steadily. My judgment is that it's certainly time to be able to get progress defined and a roadmap laid out by which we are dealing with a number of these issues. So that's exactly what we're working towards, and we're making steady progress with respect to the battle against Daesh. We're making steady progress in some of our talks in various places, and I'm hopeful that the next 6 months will actually produce some progress that's definable, tangible, and has an impact positively.
Secretary, thank you very much.
Thank you.
John Kerry is the official face and voice of the administration's foreign policy, but the president's spokesman on the National Security Council, Ben Rhodes, is also an important but less known advisor to President Obama. For example, he led efforts behind the scenes to pass the nuclear deal with Iran. Critics say he used skillful manipulation of social media and a public relations messaging technique. He was also here at the summit.
Mr. Rhodes, thank you very much for doing this to start with. Now, Americans, in terms of the perception, Americans are known to be practical people. In terms of the administration doing this on behalf of the United States, what's in it for America and the Americans?
Well, there are a couple things in it for us. Number one, we believe that the economic models that are going to succeed in the future are innovative models. And frankly, the more there's economic growth driven by innovation, the better that is for us. Those are markets for our goods. Those are going to be connections for our companies. The investments that we make in entrepreneurs around the world can pay a dividend here. So there's a very practical benefit in that sense. I think more broadly, we see these types of efforts as yielding a long-term result. They're the types of problems you try to solve in the near term in our foreign policy, but then they're the investments you make in the long term in relationship building, in networking people, and connecting them to one another and to people in the United States. And what you don't know is whether the people who came here today are going to become the successful business people or the reformers or the leaders of different countries. That's the long-term investment that we make through this type of effort.
Now, talking of the immediate term and the long term, how confident are you that the next administration will show the same kind of commitment that you would want that administration to show, that you feel you've had for an event like this?
Well, we believe that we've demonstrated the value of this type of outreach. We basically started from scratch in building this entrepreneurship platform. And since then, in 7 summits, we've reached 17,000 people. We've raised over $1 billion in capital with some of our non-governmental partners. We've done capacity building around the world. And the demand from around the world is enormous. You know, when you look at the public opinion surveys of what do people want to work with the United States on, entrepreneurship is always near the top of that list. So it's in the interest of the next administration. And also, India has committed to hosting GES next year, a center of significant entrepreneurship and commercial activity. That shows that it's not just our government, but other governments who want to carry this forward.
For a lot of people coming from various parts of the world, there's also the fun of it, more than the entrepreneurship side of it. How do you quantify the usefulness of an event like this for people who come from other parts of the world and then go back home? It's not so that it's not just about fun, it's also about doing something tangible for the region that they are from.
Well, number one, we would help that some of the people who come here, they learn skills, they network with other entrepreneurs, and they may get access to capital that can allow them to pursue an idea when they get back home. So they have a good time here, but we hope that they're gaining skills and resources and connections that will help them to succeed going forward.
Mr. Rhodes, as you know, there are different categories of countries in North Africa and the Middle East, especially since 2011. Some seem to be more or less still stable, some have gone through revolution, some are being pulverized by war. If I'm sitting in a country like Syria or Yemen or Libya, what incentive do I have to pay attention to something happening in Silicon Valley, do you think?
Well, look, if you're sitting in a country like that, your immediate concern is your own personal safety and security. And how is this conflict going to be resolved? Or how is this organization, terrorist organization, going to be dealt with? And that's what we would expect people to be focused on, of course, the safety and security of them and their families. At the same time, in the long term, the question is what is going to rebuild societies and what is going to bring greater opportunity to countries. And in fact, some of the drivers of grievances in countries has been a lack of opportunity for young people in countries with huge youth populations. And we believe the long-term solution to that is in large measure having the type of environment and the type of value on entrepreneurship that can allow people to build businesses and to connect and succeed in a global economy.
Now, let me put this to you. Some people, whether in Syria or elsewhere in the region, they would look at a country like Syria, what's happening there, and they'll say, look at the kind of commitment that the Russians are showing vis-a-vis the regime of Bashar al-Assad. Is the United States, all it can do is offer, an idea of Silicon Valley and something that may or may not work long term? What do you think of that view?
Our view is that we bring a very diverse set of tools to the table when it comes to any challenge around the world. And in Syria, we're using our military in our counter-ISIL campaign. We're using our leadership of the global financial system to essentially try to cut off sources of funding, both to the Assad regime and to ISIL and other extremist groups. We're using our political and diplomatic leadership as best we can, and as difficult as it has been, to try to pursue a solution to the conflict. We're giving significant amounts of humanitarian assistance to try to deal with the horrible suffering that we've seen there. At the same time, though, we also are showing people everywhere that we want to connect them to long-term opportunity. And the hope is, obviously, that you want the situation resolved, you want to transition to a new government. We would hope that 5 years from now, 10 years from now, 15 years from now, as Syrians are rebuilding, that they are able to also benefit from the types of skills, connections, and opportunities that are represented here. We know that's not going to be what is most relevant to people in the near term, but it's one part of how we engage people around the world.
There are people in the United States and in the region who want the United States the United States government, your administration, to take a more robust line on Syria and Bashar al-Assad, the Saudis and others in the region. 51 officials at the State Department have expressed displeasure at the policy of the Obama administration vis-a-vis Syria. On the other hand, you only have a few months left in the life of this administration. How much pressure do you feel under, given all these factors?
Look, the pressure that we feel under every day is just the horrific circumstances in Syria. The human suffering, the refugee flows, the terrorist threat that has emerged there. I think when you look at this specific question of how do we deal with Bashar al-Assad, it has been our longstanding position that he should leave power, that any political transition has to include him departing power, that we have supported groups inside of Syria who oppose Bashar al-Assad. At the same time, we very much welcome the views expressed in that dissent cable. We've had open debates as a government for many years. The problem that we see is we don't believe that there is a U.S. imposed military solution that can resolve the situation in Syria. That there are too many competing factors that we've learned ourselves from experience in Iraq, that just having a U.S. military presence doesn't restore a sense of stability and can in fact be a part of a longer conflict.
Could you talk a little bit about the core feeling of President Obama? Because a lot of people find it very puzzling. For 5 years of bloodshed in Syria, and it keeps getting worse and worse. And yet, a lot of people have concluded the worse it gets, the more solid he becomes in his position, President Obama, that he's not going to take military action in Syria. Can you explain that, possibly?
Well, first of all, what I would focus on here is, we've said this before, if we felt like there was a military option that could succeed, if we felt like there was before us a military option that had a strong domestic and international legal basis, that had a clear plan for how we were going to see it through, that could address the underlying political questions that have fueled the Syrian civil war, we would be open to that. The president has used military force in many different countries, including in North Africa and Libya. The fact of the matter is, it's not simply because we're concerned about the enormous resource allocations that go with that type of military action. It's because the president has not seen a plan that he believes could successfully bring an end to the conflict. And we believe ultimately that's going to need a political framework.
Now, there are people who will listen to that, and I'm sure you're aware of it, and they'll say, President Bush gave Iraq to the Iranians in '23. President Obama sort of reinforced the offering of Iraq to Iran, and now he's allowed the Iranians to even consolidate their grip elsewhere, meaning in Syria. And yet, your administration seems, at least in the perception of many, be getting closer to Iran, not the other way, not the opposite.
Let's say a couple of things. First of all, the Iranians had plenty of influence in Syria when we came into power. I mean, Assad has always been a client of theirs. Hezbollah has always been very active there. So if anything, Iran has been fighting to hold on to what they had in Syria. We don't see them extending, essentially, influence there. We see them fighting to protect it. And we've opposed those efforts. In Iraq, we've been very clear that we believe that the government there has to represent all Iraqis. And part of our problem with Prime Minister Maliki is that he increasingly was not governing in that fashion. We do believe that there is a better leadership under Prime Minister Abadi, and a lot of what we prioritize, if you look at where our security systems goes, is having multi-sect security forces, bringing Sunni tribes into both the political and security process inside of Iraq. With respect to Iran, we've been very clear here that we reached an agreement that we saw as very positive that focused on one issue, the nuclear issue, and that is not a symbol of a broader rapprochement. We are actually acting in opposition to Iranian policies in many parts of the region. We do believe that the nuclear deal was worth it. And I think even if you assign the worst intentions to the Iranians, you would want them to not have a nuclear weapon. Because if you take everything that they're doing in the region today that is troubling, and you put a nuclear umbrella essentially over that, that would be much more destabilizing and dangerous, even in the very difficult circumstances we have today. So we believe the nuclear deal was worth it on the merits, but that does not mean that we're not going to take a very clear line in places like Syria and Iraq about the type of political future that we want to see that is more inclusive and less subject to meddling from external forces.
On the issue of Iran, as you remember, several weeks ago, there was this whole thing about how the White House handled the press covering the issue of Iran, the whole thing about the echo chamber and all that. How genuine have you been, not just with Americans, but also with your allies in the region, about why you needed to conclude the nuclear deal with the Iranians?
Well, look, anybody who covered that debate knows that we were incredibly open and transparent about the case we were making for the deal. And it was often guided by very detailed facts about the nature of the nuclear program, the nature of the reductions in that program, the stockpile being shipped out of the country, the centrifuges being put under international monitoring. And look, obviously we tried to make the best case we could, but it was a case rooted in the facts. And I think that the best defense we can make today is if you look at how the deal has been implemented, it has been in line with what we said. They've shipped their stockpile out of the country. They've put 2/3 of their centrifuges under international monitoring. They've filled the core of their heavy water reactor with concrete. Inspectors are on the ground. So, people don't just have to judge us by what we said last summer. they can look at what we said last summer, look at what's happening today, and they match up. And that's the argument that we feel very comfortable with.
Mr. Rhodes, thank you so much.
Nice to be with you.